On the afternoon the ocean took John Denver, the sky over Monterey Bay was clear and deceptively kind. The water below was a sheet of hammered silver, sunlight bouncing off small waves, a few sailboats like white thumbprints far in the distance. On the shore near Pacific Grove, people were out walking dogs, throwing frisbees, staring at the horizon the way you do when you don't yet know that history is about to redraw itself a few hundred feet above your head. Kids chased gulls. Someone checked their watch. Cars moved lazily along Ocean View Boulevard, their drivers glancing occasionally at the sky and seeing nothing unusual in it. Up at Monterey Peninsula Airport, the light was just as innocent. In the control tower, surrounded by panels of blinking instruments and the soft, omnipresent hum of electronics, a radar screen glowed green. "Elongis 555 Juliet Delta radar contact," the controller said, watching a small blip appear near the bay. Up in the cockpit of an experimental Rutan Long EZ, registration N5555JD, a single pilot. Blonde hair gone a little thinner, glasses, a face that millions recognized more from album covers and TV specials than from the seat of a plane, leaned forward slightly, checking instruments, feeling the airplane as he'd done for decades in other machines. He was wearing a casual shirt and jeans, nothing like a touring costume, just clothes a man wears when he's doing something for himself. "Do you have it now?" he replied. Those were his last words. Seconds later, the blip vanished from the screen. Witnesses on the beach saw the small white Canard aircraft flying low over the water, suddenly pitch nose up, then roll and dive almost straight down into Monterey Bay. Some of them thought for an instant that they were watching a stunt, a trick for the cameras, a piece of aerial showmanship. Then the nose struck the water with a horrible, definitive violence. A column of spray rose. The sound, a flat, brutal smack, reached the shore a heartbeat later. The plane disappeared. John Denver, who had sung for 30 years about mountains and roads and sunshine and home, died not in the Rockies he loved, but in the cold, indifferent salt water of the Pacific. He had enough fuel for about an hour. He told people at the airport that himself. But the tank he was drawing from was running dry, and the fuel selector valve that could switch to the fuller tank was mounted behind his left shoulder. Out of sight and almost out of reach, a custom modification that required the pilot to twist in his seat and grope blindly for a small handle. It was a small piece of bad design, tucked just far enough out of the way to become lethal. Investigators would later say that he likely tried to reach for that valve, turning his body just enough to pull the airplane off balance, looking away for just long enough to lose the thin thread of control between wing and wind. The National Transportation Safety Board would write it in the language they always use: diversion of attention from the piloting task and manipulation of an inadequately located fuel selector. Behind that antiseptic phrasing sits an image: a man in a cockpit, alone, twisting his shoulder back toward the past instead of forward into the sky, and the airplane following his weight down. The selector that was supposed to keep him aloft was placed exactly where it could betray him. Up there in the clear sky, surrounded by light, his last struggle was not for poetry or melody. It was for a small, stubborn piece of hardware an arm's length behind him and a few breaths too far. On the beach, a child pointed and asked what had happened. An adult said, "A plane just crashed." Someone dialed 911 with fingers that wouldn't quite cooperate. Sirens began their long, rising howl miles away. People stood frozen, watching the widening circle of disturbed water, waiting for something or someone to break the surface. Nothing did. News travels fast when the name is famous and slow when the heart is involved. By early evening, radio bulletins were interrupting songs to say that John Denver had been in a plane accident off the coast of California. The words were cautious at first. Reports. Possible. Unconfirmed. But very quickly the phrases that mattered most, no survivors, then body recovered, settled over the country like an unseasonable frost. In living rooms in West Virginia, in dorm rooms in Colorado, in apartments in cities he'd always felt ambivalent about, people heard the name and felt something old and gentle in them flinch. They remembered Take Me Home Country Roads playing on long drives back from nowhere, all the windows down and everybody trying to hit that high note, laughing when they missed. They remembered Rocky Mountain High, making them want to go somewhere higher and cleaner than wherever they were, even if that somewhere only existed inside the song. They remembered Annie's song at weddings and anniversaries and quiet kitchen slow dances after the children had gone to bed. They remembered sunshine on my shoulders on mornings when the light through the window seemed like a fragile blessing, something to be noticed before it passed. Now the singer of those songs had died alone over water, in an airplane with a fuel lever he could not safely reach. It would have been an ugly irony if he'd simply been a country star. But John Denver had been something stranger and more specific. A man who spent his whole life trying to put into melody the feeling of belonging somewhere, and who had never entirely shaken the sense of being slightly displaced. To understand why that fuel selector, that bay, that last radio call cut so deep into the people who loved him, you have to go back to the beginning, to a kid with a different last name, in a different part of the country, whose first lessons were in movement, and whose first instrument was not a guitar, but a suitcase. He was born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. on December 31st, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico, the son of a United States Army Air Forces pilot. His father, Henry Dutch Deutschendorf, was a decorated flyer, a man of precision and discipline who set world speed records in a B-58 Hustler bomber. A man whose job was to climb into machines and take them faster and higher than they were supposed to go. From the start, the sky was not just a backdrop, it was the family business. The ground, however, never stayed still. Military life meant postings, and postings meant boxes, and boxes meant goodbye. The Deutschendorfs moved, from Roswell to Tucson, from Arizona to Alabama to Texas to Oklahoma to wherever the Air Force needed Dutch next. By the time John was in his early teens, he had gone to more schools than some kids know exist. New classrooms, new corridors, new locker combinations, new cafeteria tables where he was always the one who sat down last. He was, by his own admission, an introverted boy. At every new base, he was the new kid, the outsider with the hard-to-pronounce last name, the one who knew just enough to understand that by the time he figured out the rules of the place, it would be time to pack again. He learned to watch more than speak, to keep most of himself in a place no orders could reach. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being uprooted so often that you stop trying to put roots down. John learned early to carry his sense of self in things he could take with him. Books, small objects, routines. And then, one day, a guitar. His grandmother, seeing something in the quiet boy that needed its own language, bought him his first guitar when he was 11. The instrument became a kind of anchor he could carry in a case. Chord shape stayed the same even when the skyline did not. Strings sounded the same in Texas and in Tucson, on bases and in borrowed rooms. In a house where everything else could be put in a moving truck at any time, the fretboard stayed where he left it. In a life where every few years a commanding officer told the family where home would be next, the guitar let him build a room inside himself that no relocation papers could reach. He wasn't an instant virtuoso. He learned the way most kids do, from listening, from older boys, from songbooks, from trial and error. His fingers hurt. His rhythm stumbled. He kept going. As he got better, something shifted. He discovered that if he sang and played, people turned toward him instead of away. Music was the first thing that made other people come to him instead of him having to go to them. By high school, he had discovered that music was a passport of a different kind. At school assemblies, in church youth groups, in little local bands, he could sing and play and feel for a few minutes, like the room had stopped spinning. Then came folk music. The Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Bob Dylan. Songs that sounded simple until you tried to write one. Songs that wore their meanings right on the surface and somehow still had something deeper underneath. Songs about justice and travel and loneliness that felt like they had been written by someone who knew what it meant to live half in a suitcase. He briefly tried college at Texas Tech, studying architecture because it sounded respectable. But the pull of music was stronger. He dropped out, much to his parents' concern, and moved to Los Angeles, the city that seemed to be sucking in every young songwriter in America. He played clubs that smelled like stale beer and possibility. Monday nights with 15 people in the audience. Wednesdays with 7. Saturdays that felt, if he squinted, like they might lead somewhere. There were dozens of young men in those clubs with guitars and the same dreams. The thing that set John apart wasn't his technique, it was his sincerity. He joined the Chad Mitchell Trio as a replacement member after an audition that saw him chosen over hundreds of other hopefuls. For the first time, he was stepping into a machine that already worked. The trio had fans, bookings, expectations. He sang other people's arrangements, wore coordinated outfits, learned how to hold a microphone for television. If he felt like a guest in someone else's life, that was nothing new. On a marquee, Deutschendorf was a nightmare. One night, staring up at the awkwardly cramped letters, a club owner joked that he'd need a bigger sign. John laughed, but the joke landed somewhere deep. He started flipping through maps, looking for a name that sounded like where he wished he belonged instead of where the Air Force had dragged him. Aspen had already gotten under his skin. Denver was the nearest major city. The word felt like open space and clear air. He stepped onto a stage as John Denver, and the name fit his songs even before the songs existed. It was cleaner, shorter, easier to say. It also let him quietly separate himself from the rigid, decorated, emotionally distant father whose last name he had been carrying like an oversized jacket. His first big break as a songwriter, though, still came in someone else's voice. He wrote a song in 1966 called "Babe, I Hate to Go," a gentle, melancholic farewell about leaving on a trip and worrying that the distance would change everything. In it, he poured the ache of every childhood move, every base transfer, every half-formed friendship left behind. Every time he had seen a father or a mother standing small as a soldier walk toward a plane. His producer suggested a stronger title. "Leaving on a Jet Plane" was born. Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it in 1969. Their version went to #1. The song became an anthem for departures, for airports, for all the times people stood at gates and watched someone walk away. John's voice wasn't on the record, but his words were. He became briefly the man who wrote the song other people sang when it hurt to leave. "I hated the leaving," he said later. "I loved the flying." That contradiction, loving the sky, hating what it meant to go, would shadow him all his life. If leaving on a jet plane paid some bills and opened some doors, it was poems, prayers, and promises in 1971 that opened the floodgates. Almost Heaven, West Virginia. "Take Me Home, Country Roads" was co-written with Bill Danoff and Taffy Nivert after a night of trading lines and chords. John's clear tenor, the song's simple, yearning melody, and its image of a place that felt like home even to people who had never been there were a perfect storm. He wasn't from West Virginia. But the song resonated because he knew intimately what it meant to long for a home you'd never truly had. The words "Almost Heaven" carried the nostalgia of someone who had been packed up too many times to take stability for granted. The song climbed the charts. It settled into people like a memory they didn't know they'd been carrying. Everyone had a country road somewhere in their past. The road to grandparents' houses, to childhood rivers, to high school hangouts. John Denver had given them a way to sing it out. From there, the light poured in faster. He moved permanently to Aspen in 1969, finding in Colorado's high valleys and thin air a sense of continuity he had not known as a child. The mountains did not move. The rivers did not get reassigned. Snow fell on its own schedule, indifferent to orders. Rocky Mountain High in 1972 was his love letter back. He was born in the summer of his 27th year, coming home to a place he'd never been before. He was talking about himself, about the feeling of finally saying, This is where I stop moving. The song sparked its own small controversy. Some listeners and some members of the FCC worried that the high might be about drugs. John testified before a Senate hearing about music's impact, saying that his high was about nature, about spiritual elevation, not chemicals. In a world that was increasingly suspicious of anything that sounded like hippie code, he insisted on a different definition. At the same time, his personal life was cresting. His marriage to Annie Martel, begun in 1967, was full of the kind of intensity that makes for both great songs and eventual heartbreak. Annie's song came to him on a ski lift in Aspen after a fight and reconciliation. He said he wrote it in about 10 minutes, the melody arriving almost whole. "You fill up my senses like a night in a forest," he sang. And it felt like someone had managed for once to say something about love that wasn't cynical or guarded. It was pure, a little overwhelming, and exactly what people who were still willing to believe in that kind of love needed to hear. From roughly 1973 to 1977, he was everywhere. TV variety specials with his name in big letters. Guest spots on shows with Muppets and late-night hosts. Tours that sold out arenas and smaller theaters alike. Awards, not just in country music but in pop and adult contemporary categories. He bridged genres in a way that made some purists bristle and some fans feel like they'd found someone speaking their language in more than one world. But the same thing that happens to almost every artist who becomes for a time the face of something began to happen to him. The image hardened, while the man inside it kept changing. To fans who only saw him on TV, John Denver was the forever smiling, eternally optimistic, slightly nerdy guy in round glasses and embroidered denim who wanted to hold hands and sing about peace. To friends who knew him better, he was also a man wrestling with ego, with exhaustion, with anger, with the gap between the ideals in his lyrics and the compromises in his life. His activism was real. He testified before Congress about censorship and the dangers of labeling music as corrupting simply because it was misunderstood. He was one of the few mainstream artists to defend heavy metal bans during the PMRC hearings, arguing that freedom of expression applied even to music he personally didn't like. It was a surprising stance for the man most associated with sunshine and country roads, but it fit his deeper belief that art should be allowed to be honest, even when honesty made people uncomfortable. He became deeply involved in environmental efforts, co-founding the WinStar Foundation to promote sustainable living and global cooperation. He lent his name and time to hunger relief, to anti-nuclear campaigns, to peace initiatives. He flew with Russian cosmonauts as part of citizen diplomacy efforts, believing perhaps naively that if people could just see the Earth from above, they would be less likely to break it. At the same time, the strain on his personal life grew. The marriage that had given the world Annie's song couldn't sustain the constant absences, the temptations that come with fame, the pressure of being everyone's idea of goodness. He admitted to infidelity. He admitted to rage. He admitted that he sometimes used alcohol to smooth out the rough edges of days. When he and Annie divorced in 1982, it was as if the coda to that song had finally been written, and it wasn't as neat as the original melody. He later wrote in his autobiography about cutting up their bed with a chainsaw in anger. It is an image that sits jarringly next to the man on stage singing about filling up his senses with forests and mountains. He married again to Cassandra Delaney in 1988. They had a daughter, Jessie Bell. The pattern changed in some ways, different country, different rhythms, but the old tensions remained. Touring versus home, public responsibility versus private needs. The marriage ended in separation and divorce in the early 1990s. By then, the wider music world had shifted. The shiny, earnest folk pop of the 1970s had given way to harder-edged rock, to synthesizers, to new wave, to country that sounded more like rock and rock that sounded more like noise. John Denver's style was increasingly dismissed by tastemakers as corny, dated, soft. Record labels were less interested in new albums from him. Radio was less willing to put his singles into heavy rotation. He continued to record on his own label Windstar and continued to tour, but he was no longer at the center of the industry's spotlight. For some artists, that kind of fading can be freeing. For John, it seemed to deepen the contradictions. He was still John Denver to fans, the person they came to see for comfort, nostalgia, hope. He was also a middle-aged man dealing with the fallout of 2 divorces, the disappointments of a shifting career, and a growing dependence on alcohol. 2 DUI arrests in the early 1990s resulted in convictions, and, crucially, in the FAA revoking his medical certification. That meant he was not legally allowed to fly as pilot in command of an aircraft. For a man whose childhood had been dominated by airplanes, whose father's whole identity had been built around flying, and who had himself become an experienced instrument-rated pilot with thousands of hours, this was not a small thing. It was a blow straight to the spine of his identity. He challenged the revocation. He argued that he was addressing his issues, that he was safe. The FAA was not convinced. The sky officially was closed to him. That did not mean he stopped loving it. Friends say his passion for flying never dimmed. He attended air shows, talked endlessly about aircraft design, studied the experimental Long-EZ type he would eventually buy, dreamed of going into space. He had lobbied NASA to be the first musician in orbit and had been considered, briefly, for the civilian spot that ultimately went to teacher Christa McAuliffe on the Challenger. When the shuttle exploded in 1986 with McAuliffe on board, he was gutted. Not only as an American, but as a man who had been, by some accounts, close to being on that flight himself. Flying for him was not just a hobby. It was a way of feeling at home in a way he never quite had on the ground. When he purchased the Rutan Long-EZ N555JD in 1997, it was his way of quietly stepping back into that space. The aircraft itself, though, came with baggage he did not fully unpack. The previous owner had complained about the placement of the fuel selector and had consulted a mechanic about moving it. The modification, placing the valve behind the pilot's shoulder, was done, but it traded one problem for another. Instead of being slightly awkward, it became dangerously inaccessible. On October 12, 1997, when John Denver sat in that cockpit and strapped himself in, he was not thinking about committees or hearings or his public image. He was thinking, most likely, about the feeling of the wheels lifting, the way the coastline looked from a few hundred feet up, the familiar hum of an engine in his bones. He did 3 touch-and-go landings that day, each time circling back over the bay, dropping down, kissing the runway, and rising again. Pilots on the ground said his patterns were neat, his approaches good. He was clearly still a skilled aviator. The Long-EZ's design meant he couldn't see the fuel gauge. The moved selector meant he couldn't easily reach the switch. The last climb was a convergence of all the things he'd been wrestling with his whole life. Trust, control, movement, the thin line between safety and risk. He tried to turn back to reach what should never have been behind him. He turned. The plane turned. And the sky, which had always been both refuge and challenge, did what it always does when ignored. It stopped forgiving. The question with stories like John Denver's isn't just, how did he die? It's, what do we do with how he lived? Because for all the flaws and failures, the divorces and the DUIs, the fuel selector and the NTSB report, the weight of his life rests somewhere else, in the way ordinary people keep reaching for his songs when they need to remember that the world is still, somehow, beautiful. It's in the West Virginia Stadium where 60,000 people sing Country Roads at the end of the third quarter. The whole place briefly agreeing, if only in voice, on what home feels like. It's in the hiker in Colorado who stands at a lookout point at dusk and, without meaning to, hears Rocky Mountain High in his head as the sky darkens over the peaks. It's in the couple married 40 years who still sway a little closer when Annie's song comes on at a restaurant, both of them remembering a younger, more fragile version of themselves. It's in the environmental activist who first began caring about rivers and forests because some guy with a bowl cut on TV in the 70s told him they mattered. It's in the moment after the news of his death broke, when thousands of people around the world turned on his records not to mourn a celebrity, but to reconnect with parts of themselves they had only ever entrusted to his voice. He was not a prophet. He was not an angel. He was a man who carried his own broken selector in his chest, his inability to always choose what was good for him, his tendency to reach for the wrong thing at the wrong time, and who still insisted stubbornly on singing that life was worth loving. The ocean didn't know who he was. The long EZ didn't care. The lever behind his shoulder was indifferent to the name on the logbook. But the question his story leaves us with is not finally about that lever. It's about everything he poured into the 30 years before it. He didn't get to grow old in Aspen. He didn't get to become the gray-bearded, slightly eccentric elder of American folk pop that everyone assumed he would be. He didn't get the quiet, late-career album where his voice, roughened by years, sang with new depth about the same subjects. He didn't get the chance to walk his daughter down an aisle or sit in a rocking chair and hum country roads to grandchildren. He didn't get more time, but he did leave plenty of bottles. Not glass ones, but songs, hundreds of them, each a small, self-contained world where time behaves differently. In Take Me Home Country Roads, the drive never really ends. You are always somewhere between where you were and where you want to be. In Rocky Mountain High, he is always lying on his back, looking up at a sky crowded with stars, feeling both tiny and held. In Annie's song, love is always as big as forests and rain and sleep. In Sunshine on My Shoulders, every ray of light remains fragile and miraculous. Every time we open one of those bottles, every time a DJ cues up a track, every time a kid with an acoustic guitar learns those simple chords, every time a stadium full of spectators sings West Virginia Mountain Mama Take Me Home Country Roads in ragged unison, we are letting a little of his time leak into ours. The fuel selector behind his shoulder was beyond his reach. The selector inside our own lives, the choice to slow down, to pay attention, to decide what home really means, is not. That's the part of the story he can't write for us. So maybe the real question, standing at the edge of Monterey Bay or on a hill in Colorado or in a traffic jam far from anywhere, are these. When we find ourselves humming one of his songs, are we just killing time? Or are we remembering that time is the one thing we don't actually have that much of? And when we hear his voice asking to be taken home, do we imagine some distant, perfect place we might never reach? Or do we look honestly at the lives we're already in and ask what we'd need to change to feel, even for a verse or two, as if we were finally where we're meant to be?